Alright folks, it's time to take out the tinfoil hats. A recent interview published on comicbook.com by Christian Hoffer with Jeremy Crawford shed a lot of light on the team's thoughts, processes, and ideas for the future of Dungeons & Dragons. Not the least of which is that for the first time since the One D&D playtest process began, someone from their team has seemingly broken their firm line on their stance about future editions, with Jeremy Crawford stating that it is possible that things that were cut during this Unearthed Arcana playtest may actually end up making it into future editions years from now. So I want to talk about that and some of the other insights that we gained from this interview and what, if anything, this tells us about the state of One D&D. I will also link the full article in the description below for anyone who wants to read it. So just to get ahead of it, yeah, a lot of this is going to be pure speculation and probably some overanalysis of what is seemingly just a throwaway comment, but I do think it is more significant than that. And hey, sometimes it's just kind of fun to speculate about things, so let's just go ahead and do it. Jeremy initially doubles down on the thought that the first 5 Unearthed Arcanas were their experimental phase, and that it was actually the team's intent to swing hard and to see what stuck. He remains adamant that anything that received enough favorable support through both satisfaction scores and written feedback had a legitimate shot at making it into the 2024 core rulebooks. He reiterated that despite many of the scrapped ideas receiving over a 70% satisfaction score, that wasn't the full picture, and that written feedback was also a critical component in determining whether any given idea, feature, spell, background, or anything else really would have a chance at making it into the game officially. This, I think, is where things get a little bit tricky though. I have stated before that I believe that the design team has nothing but good intentions. I believe that they wanted to create an update to the game that felt meaningfully different and would truly feel like an improvement and an evolution to 5th edition, while also not leaving many of the new players behind with suddenly apparently obsolete books. Though, however good the intentions of the design team may have been, it doesn't change the fact that there are simply a lot of hands in the cookie jar making decisions that would have a massive impact on the game, even though those choices would have nothing to do with any of the 2024 core rulebooks or One D&D directly. The best example of this was the entire OGL situation from the beginning of the year. I'm not really going to get into the weeds on that though, or the impact that Hasbro's decisions may have had on production schedules and priorities, as I've talked about that tons in other videos, and it really isn't the focus of this one. I'm currently trying to hit a goal of 3,000 subscribers by the end of August, so if you like what I do and would like to support me, a sub to the channel would be beyond appreciated. Thanks. While I can certainly appreciate that the team may have been fully prepared to officially implement any idea presented in the first 5 UAs, and I'll take that statement at face value, the reality is just that I don't feel like this playtest was actually structured in a way to support the types of decisions and changes that they allegedly wanted to make. I mentioned this in a recent video, but there is an inherent flaw with the whole playtest process. The team is designing new playtest documents at a minimum of 1 document, but probably more, ahead of where we are, and before they've received any feedback about a prior one. This creates this really bizarre chicken and egg situation where we, the playtesters, are trying to evaluate and provide meaningful feedback about changes to a system where we don't know what the context that the future will bring is, and the team is designing future versions of those UAs without having any insight into what the community thinks about a previous document. In a lot of cases, it just feels like the left hand has no idea what the right hand is doing, and it has certainly led to a playtest that has felt disjointed and disconnected in many ways. This, though, is actually a reasonably difficult problem to overcome. Sure, they could have simply slowed the process down and not published any subsequent Unearthed Arcana until all feedback from a previous one had been fully scored and analyzed. This, while seemingly the right choice, would have caused a situation where the delay between documents could have been so significant that any momentum gained would have been immediately lost. Possible remedies could have been to create more, shorter documents for public consideration, but this doesn't alleviate the problem of us not having context for the feedback that we provide. If anything, it exacerbates that problem since we would have even less information to go off of. Alternatively, they could have kept the documents the same size that we have now, but instead significantly increased the number of people who are analyzing community feedback. This is probably the best idea, but obviously would require many more human and financial resources, but we have no concept of the team's operating budget for this project, so I don't really think it's helpful to speculate about that either. Jeremy also mentions that there was considerable feedback from the community about the amount of disruption that some of the rules changes from the early UAs would have brought to the game. He feels that they wouldn't actually have been as disruptive as many people have thought, and that the early UAs provided different paths of development for One D&D. The thing about that is, he's probably actually right. The changes presented may not have been nearly as disruptive, but the feedback they received stating that it is was probably largely a symptom of what I mentioned earlier. The left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. We don't know what the context for the future is, so it's hard to truly understand what we are currently evaluating. He goes on to mention how the inclusion of the Weapon Mastery subsystem was one of the biggest swings in the entire UA process so far, which I think is a pretty telling statement if I'm being honest. The Weapon Mastery system, while certainly a fantastic and welcome inclusion, albeit still needing some refinement, was, I think, at least pretty far from a massive swing, but it was a swing to be sure. The system added 8 abilities with varying degrees of impact and just slotted them onto an already existing subsystem, weapons. I don't think I'd be alone in suggesting that this subsystem was actually pretty tame in its design. Don't mistake that for me saying that it's bad, because it isn't. I'm just not so sure that it was the huge swing that he's suggesting it is. Honestly, I think the large reshaping of the origins and backgrounds and races from the first UA were much bigger changes with farther reaching impacts than weapon masteries are. What this suggests to me is that the team very likely has a very fundamentally different idea for what constitutes a huge swing than we as a community do. Which probably explains a lot of the confusion and mixed messaging that we've been receiving. Alright though, now it's time for the fun one. During the interview, Jeremy Crawford mentioned that there is a chance that proposed changes that scored well, but received mixed written feedback from the community, could end up as optional rules in the future book, or that they may save those designs for a future edition years from now. To tackle the first part, I think this just makes sense. It wouldn't make much sense to just completely forget about any changes that scored well but receive some mixed commentary. It suggests that the community is open and amenable to the change, but maybe some tweaks need to be made, or maybe it was just that we didn't have the relevant context to appropriately evaluate the change at the time that we received it. Keeping those ideas around for optional or region specific to future campaign settings, or to include them in something like an updated Xanathar's Guide to Everything or Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, also just seems like logical decisions. However, the most noteworthy thing that he says here is potentially saving those designs for a future edition. I want to be super clear right away that this is obviously not Jeremy Crawford confirming 6th edition or that they are working on it or anything even remotely close to that. That is not really why this is important. Why it's significant is that this is the first time in the year that the One D&D playtest process has been ongoing that anyone from the team, never mind the lead designer himself, has strayed from the company line that 5e will essentially live on to be the forever, perpetual version of Dungeons & Dragons, with some updates here and there as the years go by. You might argue that the wording of edition is essentially meaningless, as it's mostly just a relic of the past, and some games have numerous editions while not changing so much that the games are still largely interoperable. The thing is though, that the word edition in Dungeons & Dragons has context and weight assigned to it. It suggests the massive overhauls and changes that we have seen in the past with edition changes. It's also part of why the team has gone out of their way to emphasize in no uncertain terms that One D&D is not a new edition. There isn't really much of a reason for the team to be so consistent and firm with that wording if changing an edition didn't have such strong connotations associated with it. Something I've mentioned in the past and seems to keep happening is this idea that Jeremy Crawford seems to almost be quietly signaling to the community that the team wants to do more, but they just can't based on decisions made by their parent company. Things like when he mentions the old 5e book still selling well, or the ripple effects that would have been caused by changing the class progression system. Yeah, sure, it's probably me just reading way too much into it, but then he says things like they might be saving an idea for a future edition, and it really makes you think. While that might not seem like it on the face of it, and I almost certainly am overthinking it, there is some heft to the lead designer for Dungeons & Dragons casually stating something which directly contradicts everything that we've been fed by them for the past year. I want to be clear again that even if it does eventually come to fruition, I don't think that a 6th edition is coming anytime soon. I would suspect that if it does arrive, it would come at a minimum of 5 years from now, but likely even longer. I don't think that the team is also intentionally gimping One D&D either just to promote sales of a future edition. I think the shape and form that One D&D is taking is, unfortunately, largely a byproduct of short-sighted profit-driven decisions by Hasbro rather than the design team. If a new edition does exist in the future, it's going to be because Hasbro deemed that 5th edition is simply no longer profitable enough to justify keeping it around, but until then, I don't think that we'll be seeing any major changes. As for me, when I think about the abandoned ideas that I would love to see make their way into a hypothetical 6th edition, to the surprise of absolutely no one, I have to say templated Wildshape, though with a lot of adjustments, and the revised exhaustion rules. Let me know what drop features or rules you would like to see make a return in the future in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing to help me reach my goal of 3,000 subs by the end of August. Check out some of my other One D&D videos, but otherwise, take care.